Hey everyone, it's Drew. This is the Anthony Morey and Perry Kulper tutorial. Before we start, we are going to really briefly talk about Morey and Kulper's way of design. Their drawings are all very self-referential, as we've discussed before. So the big thing I want to say for this tutorial is that if you make a mistake, don't Control-Z it, don't undo it, don't delete it. We're actually going to keep it because those two architects are concerned about the architecture of thought rather than the architectural objects themselves. So by keeping those elements that we've messed up on, we can actually kind of scatter them throughout the drawing and reinterpret them, if you will. So obviously that's going to require a lot of different copies of this thing to be made. So this is my couch surface with the lines, the points, the surface, the intersections, the whole shebang. If you haven't already, go ahead and make a duplicate file by doing File Save As, and then just saving it as a different name. You don't want to overwrite any of the data that you have already done so far this semester. So what's really essential for me are the surfaces and the intersections and possibly the grid being underneath here. So if I control click on each of these layers, or on a Mac you can, you can control click. You can right click on the selection and do select objects. And what we're going to do is copy that over at a consistent increment. So if I click on this bottom corner and type in 20 feet and hit enter, that's basically going to move it in a consistent radius around this base point. And if I hold down shift and then click, it's going to put it 20 feet exactly away at a 90-degree angle. And now I'm going to type in 40 feet and do the same thing just to keep that increment of 20 going. And basically what that's going to allow us to do is have a selection that we can lock. So we're going to go ahead and type in lock on this one. This is a selection that we can constantly reference back to. And then this is the selection that we're actually going to be breaking apart and kind of reconstituting throughout the drawing. So we probably don't need the grid on this far left one quite yet. If you look at a lot of Anthony Morey and Perry Kulper's drawings, they usually use some kind of grid underlay. So what I'm actually going to do is just select objects on the grid layer and control click to deselect the ones from this kind of middle one we have going, and we're going to move it over by 20 feet, and we'll probably reference that at some point later. But in the meantime, we want to make several copies of this. I did a speed run of this tutorial yesterday just to kind of get an idea of what I wanted to talk about and what kind of the fundamental things we should be discussing in it are. And one of the big things with Anthony Morey and Perry Kulper is the color scheme. So if I type in picture, that's going to open up this folder that basically allows me to pick any kind of like PNG or JPEG from my computer. So obviously you can go through like your desktop or whatever. And I'm rather fond of this color scheme, which is the one that I ended up using for my first run at it. So if I just double click on that or open it up, what it'll allow me to do is click on a corner of the image and then of course click and drag it to fully expand it, and we can just use this as a reference for our color palette throughout the tutorial. And I'll be uploading kind of all the color schemes that I've collected over the years to the box, so you guys can sift through those and see which one speaks to you emotionally. So what we want to do with this drawing is do a deconstruct this couch object, reinterpret it, and layer it ultimately. So I'm going to show you one way of doing this. Of course, you can take your own liberties. In fact, I'm going to ask you that you do so simply because you're not going to be able to follow this tutorial to a T. It's more about the fundamentals of what I'm doing that you can reinterpret to kind of show the couch in your own unique way. But I think a couple of the things that we want to cover are renders, stacks in Rhino, and then a lot of the work's actually going to be done in Illustrator. But for right now, let's focus on the Rhino part of things. I'm going to go ahead and select my surface. If it's not already exploded for you, all you have to do, like if it's a poly surface like this where it selects the whole object, all you have to do is type in explode. And you're going to get a different command line up here than I am, simply because mine was already exploded, but it should say exploded into 5 or 6 different pieces. And what that's going to do is allow us to select our intersecting lines and our top surface. And I'm going to go ahead and group those. And bring it over to the side. So now we just have like the sides and the bottom of the couch. And I want to show you all a command called rotate 3D. And what that's going to allow you to do is, instead of just like rotating it this way, it'll allow you to rotate it this way. So if I click the first point of our axis, which is going to be this, since we want to rotate this down, that's what's going to be our axis. So if we click one end of it and then the other end of it, now we can see that our C-plane, for lack of better words, is going to be reset. So if we click on the middle of this vertical line, we can see that we're rotating around that way instead of horizontally. So if I hold down Shift, that's again going to lock it to 90-degree increments. I want to make this thing entirely flat, and I'll explain why in a second. But we're going to do the same rotate 3D command with this. We're going to do it with this. Alternatively, if you have the gumball tool selected, and that should be down here. If it's not, you can just type in the gumball command. You can actually take this red arrow. We can see that that's the one that's going in the direction that we want. And we can freeform rotate it around there. We can either type in negative 90 degrees and then move it to where it's supposed to be. Or we can simply shift on it, and again, it's going to lock it into place for us. So in a lot of Morey and Kulper's drawings, they have like the main object and then they have some kind of underlay. So what I'm going to do is actually stack these things together in some kind of straight line. So if I go back to this piece and rotate it, again, this is kind of where your artistic liberties are going to come into play, and you can do whatever you'd like with this portion. I'm basically going to make them all align so that this single flat face, the opposite of kind of my curved piece, is a consistent datum line throughout the entire thing. So again, I'm just selecting something, typing in the move command, and moving it to a new point. And I actually don't want this bottom piece. It's kind of boring. So now that I have all of these in a straight line, if I select all of those and hold down Alt, what that's going to do is allow me to use the gumball tool to make a copy of what I just selected. Alternatively, you can just use the copy command and then move it over whatever 5 feet. But I want to select the one that we just copied over and rotate it 180 degrees. And then type in the move command to kind of interlock it back with the original thing. A big component of a lot of Morey and Kulper's drawings as well is a lot of asymmetric qualities. So what we're going to do, I know we've talked about scale in this class, but I don't know if we've talked about scale 1D. If we type in scale and click on 2 points, it's going to scale everything proportionally. Because we want to maintain these kind of sidelines, we can do what's called scale 1D. And if I click on this corner and then maybe like the midway point, and then we can see that it's only going to scale things in one direction. So if I basically just double the width of this thing, there's a nice asymmetric nature going on here. And what we're going to do is select all of that, and we're going to put it below this. This is going to be our focal point of the project, so we're going to leave it on the top layer. Before we do that, we're going to go ahead and do, let's say, surface 01, so that we know it's supposed to go below this guy right here. If we change the layer color to, let's say, green, and then while we have these selected, right click and change object layer, it's going to bring them over to that layer. So if we bring this underneath here, basically all we want to do, there's no real rules for this. We just want to make sure that this is below this surface right here, because as we talked about, if two things are in the same place at the same time, it's not going to make the line work for it consistently. So holding down Alt again, I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this surface, and I'm going to go ahead and scale it proportionally. Let's do it this way this time. So we've basically doubled the size of this thing. Again, with this idea of being asymmetrical, I'm going to go ahead and rotate this, I don't know, maybe 15 or negative 15 degrees rather. And what that's going to do is give us just a nice contrast between this and this. So we'll notice again that the surface that I just made is below this one, and you can start to play with that, but we're not going to do that quite yet. I have to go through explaining how set views work. But I'm going to make another layer called surface O2, and we'll change that to red, and then we'll change the objects to that layer. Cool, so I think we have a pretty good foundation for this so far. In a lot of Morey and Kulper's work, they deconstruct the object, so they show the whole thing, which is effectively what we're doing with this top surface, but they also start to break down the different parts of the project. So I'm going to go ahead and move this stuff out of the way. And you'll notice that I haven't joined any of these surfaces yet. So if I select those and then again Alt drag, I still have all of the individual pieces. Actually, I'm going to go with the smaller versions from that middle layer, that green layer. So if I Alt drag on that, I'm going to have all the individual components that we started out with, kind of each side of the couch doubled up. So if I go to create a new layer, I'm going to name it Fragments, let's say Fragments Dark. And then I'm going to make another one called Fragments Light. And then we'll change the color to maybe a dark blue and a light blue. I'm going to copy this once more and basically assign this one to dark and this one to light. So if I have that selected, I can just right click, change object layer. Do the same thing on this one. A lot of this should be kind of second nature at this point based on the tutorials that we've done so far. And now what we're going to do is rotate these and scatter them. So in the one that I did for a test run of this project, we are going to basically what I did is put the dark ones on top and I kept them pretty normal, and then the lighter ones I put on the bottom, and those I started to play with the rotation on a lot of that stuff. So what I'm going to do is make sure that both of these are below this red layer right here. And because this is the light one and we want it to be closer to the bottom, we're going to control click that to deselect it and then bring that one down a little bit further. So if we look at these pieces, I think this would be a good time to talk about setting views. So if you'll notice, we're kind of inconsistent as far as how we have been viewing this thing. We've been rotating around a lot and it's not really a consistent angle for us. So what we can do is find a view that we like. I think we have enough here that we can kind of judge compositionally what this thing is going to be. If I'm kind of looking forward, I would imagine this is going to be kind of rule of thirds off to the side, and then we can just kind of fill in the rest of the environment with this. And once I'm happy with the view and the angle that I'm at, I can go to this drop down and type, go to the set view portion and named views down here at the bottom. And it's going to bring up this panel. All we have to do is type in save as, and we will say Morey Kulper view 1. And what that's going to do is bring up a set view. So if I rotate around the model, whoops, I misaligned. What I can do is just go back to this drop down, set view, and then it should pop up underneath here. If it doesn't pop up down here, again, you can click name views and just double click on this, and it'll bring it back to how it was before. So there's some, I think for the most part, this is working pretty well. I think that the red stuff probably needs to come off to the side a little bit, simply because there was kind of a bottleneck right here. If we bring that over a little bit, and then maybe bring it back a little bit, I think compositionally that starts to work a lot better. So let's play with the fragmentation of this thing. So these should all still be individual components. So what I'm going to do is basically drag this over. This part is probably going to be the most arbitrary or random part of the tutorial. And you'll notice that in a lot of their work, it's not actually arbitrary at all. There's some kind of notational system that brings the entire thing together, and that's what we're going to do with this project. So you can kind of place these however you want. The gumball tool is especially important for this. I wouldn't mess with the vertical part of it at all. I would simply stick with the green arrow and the red arrow to move it kind of left and back. But I'm going to speed forward through this part really quick just because I'm going to be doing the exact thing that I just said for a little bit, and you don't need to watch me do that at real time. Okay, so now that we've done that with the upper layer, the dark fragments, if you will, we want to do something a little bit more interesting with this bottom layer. What we're going to do is that notational system that I described, we're basically going to put lines across all of these, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. But I think these ones we want to start to rotate maybe at a 30-degree increment, just because we're in an isometric view. We can do it with whatever pieces we'd like. If you click on the gumball, it should maintain that information. If not, you can just type in 30 and hit enter. You can also do -30 if you're feeling rebellious. And basically, we're going to rotate a couple of these pieces and create grid lines that start to do something different than what the top layer is doing, to show that, you know, couch pieces, they may not be assembled in this perfect way that we're implying with this set. So now that we've rotated those pieces a little bit, we're going to drag those along as well. You'll notice that I kept these in a straight line. I might actually do these in more of a curved manner, just to kind of fill out the composition. We're kind of lacking down here. Again, if I go to the drop-down set view, Morey Kulper view 1, that'll give me the exact view that I'm going to end up having in Illustrator. So you'll notice that these pieces are underneath this, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted. I actually might shift these over a little bit, just so there's more overlap and we can start to show that depth a little bit better. Great. So we're going to be grabbing these pieces and doing the same thing that we just did, except we're going to kind of create this curved line that I just talked about. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. I don't think I've rotated, but we're going to go ahead and go back to our set view, Morey Kulper view 1. And I think that compositionally, if we move this over here and this down here, it's actually going to start to work a little bit better. Okay, so I think we're in a pretty good spot with this. Now we need to have some kind of notational system, so I'm going to create 2 new layers, one of which is going to be called Fragments Dark Grid, and the other of which is going to be called Fragments Light Grid. And again, we're going to change the colors to like a dark green and a light green, just so we can kind of keep that same logic going. So if I go to the dark grid and select that layer, I'm going to, of course, associate that with the dark pieces. So if I type in line, what I'm going to be able to do is I'm going to click on the midpoint of this straight edge, the one that's opposite of the curved edge, and you all should have something similar. If not, I mean, the notational system is something that is going to vary from project to project, and I know that some of you have some very interesting Rhino models, so it may not be exactly what I'm doing here, but again, it's about the composition and the overall fundamental things that I'm doing that you can interpret for your own project. So if I type in line and go to the center point of the side opposite of this curved one, you're going to notice that this little white dot pops up, and that's basically going to show like it's a perfect 90-degree angle from where my mouse is at to that point. Sometimes it'll disappear once you click, but it usually won't. If I type in B and hit enter, what that's going to do is bring up, it's going to allow me to make a line that goes both directions. So I want to make sure that we're exceeding the boundaries of the viewport that we've already set up. And now once I have a really big line like that, I can just type in copy and click on that midpoint and basically put it on all of the other midpoints of those dark blue pieces. So now I want to do the same process, but with the light blue pieces, and I think it would be easier to do if we turned off the dark fragments layer, switched to the light grid layer, and turned off the dark grid layer. And we're just going to do that same process. So if I type in line, hit enter, type in B, hit enter, we're going to be able to do that same process. But we rotated some of these pieces. So where it gets interesting is we can copy from this midpoint to the midpoint of another piece that's rotated, like this. We're going to go ahead and do that for all of them, and then come back and fix it afterwards. So in a situation like this, it's a really simple way to address it. You simply select the line and type in rotate. Not rotate 3D like we did earlier. But if we click on the center point and somewhere on the line, if this near command doesn't come up, basically you're going to want to turn on OSnap down here. Make sure that that's highlighted, and then click. This is usually the set that I have. Sometimes I'll hit center, but usually not. I usually do end, near, point, mid, intersect, perpendicular, quad, and not. Sometimes vertex, but again, usually not. It's a very specific situation. So if I click on the center point somewhere along the line, and then somewhere along the bottom of the surface, we're going to see that that line gets rotated, and it's perfectly in line with the bottom of it. And we're just going to do that for the rest of these really quick. Sweet, I think that's looking pretty good. We're gonna turn on all the layers that we had already turned off, go back to our named view, and we're just gonna look for moments that don't look too hot as far as like a lot of crowding of information. So like this one, for example, it gets kind of close to some of the other ones. So I'm gonna select both of those by shift clicking and dragging it down a little bit. I think that this gets kind of to be a weird moment. So if we click this and drag that across just to get it out of the hecticness of that little intersection, I think that looks a lot better. We just want to be able to read everything that's happening inside of this drawing. So with this, we can see that this little area is intersecting, so we're going to drag it like this. And I think this is looking a lot better. This overlapping this might be an issue, so we're actually going to click both of these and drag, I don't know, maybe this way and back this way a little bit. And then go back to our set view. And I think I'm pretty happy with this. Maybe we'll nudge this over a tad bit. Again, a lot of this is just kind of micromanaging and doing what looks right and what allows you to read all the information across this thing. I think the similar situation's happening right here. We're gonna have to drag this one out. She's basically just looking at all the surfaces and making sure that everything is legible. We're gonna start out by making a 2D of the entire thing, but we're also gonna do everything individually, and that's because we need to be able to have some kind of reference line work layer in Illustrator, but we also need to be able to import things individually. So once we're sure that this is great and it's wonderful and it's perfect, let's start to move this down a little bit actually, then we can do the make 2D command. First, we're going to do everything as a whole, and then we're going to do everything individually, simply because we want to have some kind of baseline work layer and then be able to individualize the components that we're bringing into Illustrator. So making sure that we're in our set view and the named view, we can highlight all of this stuff, oops, and type in make 2D. And it might take your computers a second, but if we go into our top view, we'll see that all of that line work is going to be there. We're also going to see that I didn't offset this intersecting grid line, so I want to do that real quick, but I think this is a pretty good base layer. So we're going to grab this guy, ungroup it, deselect the surface by control clicking, move this up 0.1 inches, shift click on the surface and regroup it. So that looks pretty good. If we go back to our named view, we're going to do a make 2D of this first. I usually go top down on this part of the tutorial, simply because it is easier to hide things and then not have to bring them back or worry about selecting around those things. So if I do a make 2D of this, and I look at our top view, I'm just going to bring that down somewhere below the line work that we've done before, and I'm going to go ahead and group it. You'll notice that I had the scene silhouette on over here. We actually do not want that to happen, so I'm actually going to delete this, make sure that we're in the right view, type in make 2D, and we want to get rid of the scene silhouette simply because a lot of what Kulper and Morey do is boundless, or they don't have some kind of surrounding line work. So if I go ahead and hit OK, we're no longer going to have that outline on the project. So if I click here, it's only going to be the one line. So I'm going to go ahead and group that. And now that I've made 2D of that, I'm going to go ahead and hide that piece. Another thing I want to do now that we kind of have this final composition in place is we're going to go ahead and join this surface before we do a make 2D. But we will do a make 2D nonetheless. So the reason that I did the join command is that it just gives us the outline for that piece. If I didn't have that, basically what would happen is when these are all different pieces, and I do the make 2D command, it's actually going to show up as something that's very regimented and kind of checkerboarded out, and we don't really want that probably. So we're going to stick with what we had before, this kind of simple outline. And now that we have all of these modeled, or make 2D rather, we're going to go ahead and hide that, and we're going to do the same process with this layer right below it. Join, make 2D. I want to double check that I'm in the right view. We are. And then we're going to bring this down here. We're going to make sure that's grouped. We're going to make sure that's grouped. We also want to make sure that these are spaced out pretty well. Illustrator, it doesn't maintain these groups. We're actually just going to have to do like a click and drag. So we basically just want to make sure that we're able to select everything individually in Illustrator, like that. So we now hide this layer. The next layer that's up is going to be these dark fragments. So what we're going to do is select those, make sure that we're in the right set view, do a make 2D. Go ahead and group those and drag them down. It's a pretty repetitive process, and the reason that we're doing this will be pretty apparent once we get into Illustrator. We'll go ahead and hide that layer, and we're going to have to do the grid lines for the dark layer next. I'm going to group that. We're going to go ahead and hide that layer that we just did a make 2D of, and we're going to go ahead and select the light fragment layer, make 2D, group, and then finally we are going to do it for these. Group. Okay, so now I think we're in pretty good shape. The notational thing that I was talking about earlier, we can't just arbitrarily move these pieces around. We have to show that there's some kind of logic behind their rotation and what the pieces are and where they come from. So what we're going to do is create a new layer. I'm going to collapse this make 2D. What we're going to do is create a new layer called curved corner lines, and we'll make it a nice, we'll make it white, and we're going to select that layer. So what I mean by this is we want to show that like this piece is the same as this piece, and we're going to do that through the use of curved arrows. I would probably do it on ones that you rotated on this bottom layer and then compare that to one up top. So for example, if I type in line and click on the corner points of these, because those are the same piece, that will be a good start. Let's do like 3 or 4 of these maybe. So we know that this piece connects to this piece. We know that this piece and this piece are the same. And maybe we'll do one more if we can find a good kind of cross for them. Let's do this corner. Did I click it? Yep. This corner and this corner. So what I can do now is I'm going to go ahead and offset. Actually, this one might not be a good one just because it crosses through our kind of main render. Well, it should be fine. What we're going to do is offset it by like maybe 3 inches. Let's do 6 inches. And this is going to depend on what unit and what scale your couch is in. But if I want a curved line going from here to here, we know that the arc is going to be at its highest point over on this side, so we're going to offset it to this side. We're going to do the same thing here. If you right click, you can just run the same command that you just ran. Do it here, and we will do it here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to focus on this one right now. But if I type in this control point curve and I hit the drop down menu for it, I can do this second option, which is going to interpolate the points, which basically means no matter what, the line will pass through the lines that you click, or the points that you click. So if I go ahead and click that one, and I click on one corner, the midpoint of this one, and the other corner of this, what that's going to do is give me this nice curved line that starts to break up some of the straightness that we've been seeing in a lot of these grid lines. And we're going to do the same process with all of them. If the the midpoint thing isn't popping up, that's going to be down here, this midpoint on the O snap. We're just going to repeat the process. Delete those. Select these two. The midpoint might be tough to click on this one. In that case, all we have to do is turn off the layer that line work is on. So if we go back here, we can go through the midpoint here, click on that, and we can click on the midpoint here and do something like that. Okay, I think this looks pretty good, folks. So because we did this after the Make 2D, we're actually going to go ahead and select all of the curved lines that we just made and group them. And then we're going to bring them down here where we can access them and have a duplicate copy of them once we bring it into Illustrator. So we're actually going to do a render really quick. And again, this is something that we've done twice. We're going to do a render of this main top piece. So I'm going to upload a box of all like the different color schemes and nice things that I found over the years, like we did with this. And I'm going to try to match this surface with one of these colors. And there's a couple ways to do that. I'm just going to ballpark it for this tutorial because it's, obviously going to change its appearance based on, the plastic material and the sunlight settings and all that jazz. So if I select these two, or actually I just need to select the surface itself. I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of it by hitting Alt and then dragging it out to the side. And then if I go to Properties, Material, New Material, Plastic, I'm actually going to bring this a little bit closer. What I can do is go to the color and try to match this as best as I can. So if I go over to the red, that's actually pretty close, the default red value. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. If you don't like the reflectivity, you can certainly adjust that. If you don't like the frosted versus polished ratio, you can certainly change that. I think it looks pretty nice with this reflectivity on it, so I'm going to keep it. This is the point where we go into our sun settings, and we can either turn it on or off. I'm going to turn it on for the sake of this tutorial. And let's see here. If I go to my render settings by right-clicking on this guy, I can make sure the skylight isn't super intense. So if I drop this down to like maybe a 0.5 or a 0.25, I think there's a bit more contrast there and it starts to read pretty nicely. So I think this actually looks pretty good. If we go to our Morey Kulper View 1, oh, I actually did it on the wrong one, my bad. If I go ahead and type in show, this is the one that we're actually going to want to do it on. So we'll go ahead and make that the same plastic material. And what we're going to do is hide everything except for this. And we're also going to turn off the ground plane simply because we only want this to be rendered. So if we zoom into that, we can probably keep our render settings the same as what we did last time. We're going to go ahead and make sure that transparent background is checked. And I think we're good to render. So we're going to have a black background, which is good. That means that the transparency is working, but that's only going to be, of course, if we save it as a PNG. So we're going to go to Save Image As, do this drop down, make sure it says PNG, and we'll do Morey Kulper red render. And we should be good to go. So I think at this point, we're going to be able to kick it over into Illustrator. If you would like, you can actually do a render of this entire thing. You're certainly more than welcome to do that. I suppose I'll just do it real quick if it's something that anyone wants to do. If we go back to our Morey Kulper view 1, so now we're going to render this entire workspace. So what we want to do is go to the rendered view, go to our render settings by right-clicking on it, and we're going to turn the ground plane back on. Simply so we can get the shadows that some of these things are casting. Alternatively, if you don't like the way that this looks, because this is flat up against that surface, you can actually just make, you can turn off the ground plane, and you can actually just make like a big rectangle that goes below this layer. So if I type in rectangle and make a new layer called bottom layer, I can type in rectangle and effectively just make a big old rectangle that goes around this entire thing, and type in planar SRF, and what that's going to do is make a planar surface, and we want to make sure that that's below this bottom layer. So if I click on it and type in move and move it from this corner to the bottom corner of our bottom layer, we can move it down even a little bit further. And basically, we just want to make sure that it's covering the entire set view that we have done. So we're good here. All four corners are not visible. So now we can go into our rendered view. I usually like to lock the bottom layer. And we can see that a lot of these pieces actually aren't turning up super well. And that's because the skylight is treating it the same as everything else on here. So if I go ahead and select our light fragments, dark fragments, and our two surfaces, we can select all of those objects, go to Properties, Material, New Material, Plastic, and what I like to do is usually bat around 175 or 200 for the RGB code. So if you click on the color and this thing pops up, I usually type in like 175, 175, 175, and that'll give this a nice kind of contrast from the rest of the background. And from this point, you can start to play around with the sun settings. I'll probably set it here to Omaha NB, and just play around with it until there's a nice kind of base layer going, or a nice set of shadows where we can start to read a lot of this depth and what's happening on the ground. We also notice that this shadow kind of came in out of nowhere, so we're going to go ahead and hide all of this stuff, and that gets rid of the shadows that were just there. So if we go back to our set view, I think this looks pretty close. If we do something like this to get this shadow up here in view, I think this looks pretty good. So we're going to go ahead and render this as well. We should be able to use the same settings that we used before. Wonderful. So we actually probably don't want this red one to be shown simply because we have a separate render for it. So what we're going to do is change it to that same color of plastic that everything else is, because this is just going to be like a really light kind of background layer for the entire thing, which we'll explain once we get into Illustrator. But once I've changed that to gray, I'm going to go ahead and re-render it. All right, so this is looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and save this as a PNG, as Morey Kulper gray render. I misspelled his name, but we're going to leave it. So once I have that saved, we are going to go ahead and come back into our top view, and we're going to export all of this into Illustrator. And the way we're going to do that is by selecting it, doing File, Export Selected. We'll call it Morey Kulper line weight. And we'll go ahead and save this as an AI file. And it's going to bring up this pop-up menu where it says Preserve Model Scale. We're going to make sure that's checked, and we're going to make sure that we're in the top view, and we're going to make sure that RGB is the one that's selected. This is going to depend on the person and how much line work you've done and how far off the extent of the screen that you've gone. 50:1 seemed to work pretty well for me last time. So that is the scale that I'm going to do it at. And for the next portion, we're going to get into Illustrator.